So hello everyone. It's really great to see how many colleagues and students found their ways here on a Friday morning. Johannes Voelz brought us together on this sunny Friday morning at this international roundtable in order to discuss the issue of security from various disciplinary perspectives. Our discussion is prompted by the happy occasion of the publication of Johannes' most recent book, The Poetics of Insecurity, American Fiction and the Uses of Threat. And this came out this year in 2018 with Cambridge University Press. It is a book, I think, that makes a strong claim for the significance of literature for our understanding of security and hence of literary studies within security studies, or of the kind of interdisciplinary dialogue that we're staging here. I quote from the Poetics of Insecurity, page 2. Johannes says, "Literature turns our attention to aspects of security that remain difficult to perceive as long as it is analyzed, the way it's usually done, within the parameters of political and social theory." So before Johannes takes over and provides us with some more introductory statements and the rationale of this roundtable, give me just 1 minute to introduce him properly. Johannes Voelz came to Frankfurt via Berlin, Berkeley, and Stanford, and he's now Heisenberg Professor of American Studies, Democracy and Aesthetics here at Goethe University Frankfurt. And this is a highly renowned professorship funded by the German Research Foundation. He has numerous publications on the issue that concerns us here, and I mention only the most recent ones. There is his special issue, Chance, Risk, Security, Approaches to Uncertainty in American Literature, which came out in 2016 in Amerika-Studien, American Studies. There is a special issue of Telos, which came out in 2015 and which is called Security and Liberalism. And there are numerous articles such as Cold War Liberalism and The Problem of Security, which came out in 2014. And with that, I hand over to you, Johannes.
Thank you very much, Astrid. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for coming on this Friday morning. I completely agree with Astrid that this is not at all to be taken for granted. I want to also welcome our panelists. I'll introduce them briefly, but first of all, I'm very, very grateful for your willingness to participate, also for taking the trip to Frankfurt from Lisbon and even from Ottawa, so that's a long trip. This is really a special occasion, makes me very, very happy. I will first introduce Susana Araujo. She is a senior researcher at the Center for Comparative Studies of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Lisbon. And she has been the director and a principal investigator of a research group called, known by its acronym CILM, which stands for City and Insecurity in Literature and the Media. I think of Susana as one of the pioneers within literary studies to take up the question of security. And in fact, she is one of the most prolific editors of special issues on that topic. And this goes all the way back at least 10, 12 years. But I think in terms of her own writing, she's best known for her book, which is called Transatlantic Fictions of 9/11 and the War on Terror, Images of Insecurity, Narratives of Captivity, which came out in 2015 with Bloomsbury. Interestingly enough, we actually didn't meet in a security context. We met before we both started working on that topic. And so it's been nice to sort of watch each other's projects from a distance. They are quite different, but nonetheless both from within the same discipline. Next to Susana is Michael Williams. Michael is professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He is a specialist of international relations and particularly security studies and political thought. I'll just mention a couple of his book titles. They include Security Beyond the State, Private Security in International Politics, which came out with Cambridge in 2011. And then a book that I actually taught in several of my classes called Culture and Security, Symbolic Power and the Politics of International Security, which came out with Routledge in 2007 and which takes a Bourdieu-influenced perspective on discourses and debates of security. Most recently, Michael has been involved in reconsidering the legacies of realism within international relations, an approach that for a long time was deemed unfashionable. But I think that reading Michael's work gives us sort of a fresh take on what is perhaps to be salvaged from that tradition. And he's moreover conducting research in the field of political aesthetics, which is something that is also very dear to what several colleagues of mine and I are trying to do here at Frankfurt. So I'm looking forward for that for these rich interdisciplinary overlaps. I also want to mention that Michael was gracious enough to be one of the readers for this book in its function as my habilitation. And that alone, I think, is a heroic effort, because I know how much time it takes to read through a habilitation and write a 10-page report. So I'm still grateful for that. Next to Michael is Andreas Fahrmeier, who is professor of 19th century history at Goethe-Universität Frankfurt. I'll just also mention a couple of his book titles because that will show you how closely his work actually impinges on all of these questions of security. In particular, I want to point you to his book on citizenship, which is entitled Citizenship, the Rise and Fall of a Modern Concept, and came out with Yale University Press in 2007. And he's also, he's written many books on Germany in the 19th century, on Europe in the age of the revolutions. But he's also recently co-edited a book along with Gunther Hellmann, which is absolutely relevant for our discussion today, The Transformation of Foreign Policy, Drawing and Managing Boundaries from Antiquity to the Present. So which in addressing the border, I think speaks to one of the spatial constellations of security and insecurity. Finally, Astrid Erl is professor of English and Anglophone literatures here at Goethe-Universität Frankfurt. She is the author of, by now, many seminal works in the field of memory studies, among which is Memory and Culture from 2011. She's also right now finishing a book in progress. Yes, she's nodding. She's owning up to it. The working title, as far as I know, is Audition Travels, A Literary History of Modern Memory. But her work is, I think, in many ways also directly related to the questions that we are addressing today, because you worked very much on the cultural and transnational memory of war and trauma. And war and trauma are, of course, along with peace, perhaps, central components of the discourse and the problematic of security and insecurity. So again, thank you all four of you for participating in this. I want to begin by briefly sort of, as you said, give the rationale for today's event. And I want to really address our topic as a contemporary social key issue. I think this is exactly what security and insecurity are. But I want to be specific from the outset in what sense I think security is a contemporary key issue, not in the sense that the world is objectively more insecure than in the past, and that therefore security has become a more pressing issue. I do not think that that argument can be made. In many ways, we could say we live more safely than ever before. But the world is increasingly being seen through the lens of security and insecurity. And I just want to briefly explain what I mean by that. We are surrounded by uncertainty, and from within the perspective of security, that uncertainty is often interpreted as a threat. And what is evoked here is a logic of emergency. And emergencies call for extraordinary and preemptive measures. These measures are then carried out in the name of security, which refers, of course, to the title for today's discussion. And today this has become an absolutely familiar logic to us. We know it not only from international relations and foreign policy, we know it from the very mundane and everyday life experience. We know it from airport security, of course. We know it from the question of whether it is still safe to hang out at train stations, or whether we should worry that we are perhaps in a target area. But it doesn't even just relate to questions of terrorism. Even questions relating, for instance, to the management of our health are issues that are being discussed and approached through that lens and perspective of security and insecurity. Now, as security is becoming a social key issue, this is something that is taken up and reflected in academia. And what is happening is that many different disciplines are taking up the question of security. Disciplines including international relations and security studies proper as a sort of subset of international relations, but of course also anthropology, sociology, history, literature and media studies, not to mention all of the directly applied sciences that deal with issues of, for instance, technical security. But I want to emphasize that with all of these disciplines taking up security, there's in fact very little agreement on method. There's very little agreement on the scope of the problem. And there's also little agreement on the principal aim of looking at security and insecurity. And I think that I would venture to suggest that we can make a sort of a fundamental distinction between those disciplines that have a dimension of application and those that do not. And in one way or another, applicative sciences tend to approach insecurity with the goal of converting insecurity into security. And that's a fundamental that's a very distinct perspective. They may come to the result that security can never be achieved solidly. It is always something tenuous and unstable. But nonetheless, from that perspective, security is the goal of the whole endeavor. When we look at those disciplines that don't really have that applicative dimension, the perspective changes, and I think that is very remarkable, especially in the humanities version of security studies, where the interest is not in turning insecurity into security, but rather into explaining and understanding how insecurity logics work, what insecurity enables, how people come to accept insecurity, how insecurity is being experienced, how it is being communicated, how it is mediated, and in short, how it is also experienced. A totally different, I think, starting point of approaching the issue. So based on those, all of those differences, interdisciplinarity, it's always fashionable to talk about interdisciplinarity, but interdisciplinarity in this particular case is a real challenge. But most of all, I consider it a privilege and an opportunity, and so this is also why I'm so glad that it turned out that we have a real interdisciplinary setup. And in that spirit, I'll briefly perhaps relate the perspective on security that I inhabit sort of from within literary studies. When I first started working on this project, my initial concern was really the post-9/11 situation in which Homeland Security became almost the dominant discursive topic in American society and American culture. And there was a strong sense, and I shared that sense very much, that we need to sort of politically engage the politics of security as something that is deeply problematic, precisely because it is often undemocratic, because it is part of legacies of state violence, etc., etc. But when I started thinking about how to approach security through literature, at that point, Susanna hadn't published her stuff yet. I was really sort of out there in the desert and didn't really know where to look. But the most immediate point to go to is, of course, the disciplines at that point that were already working on the issue. And so the field of security studies and international relations proved particularly fruitful. And there's one point that I found particularly fruitful in many of the approaches, particularly in what is called critical security studies and what comes out of sort of the European branch of security studies that interested me most. And Michael Williams's work was certainly formative in that regard. And that is that security studies provided theories that can explain how so-called securitization happens. That is, how issues come to be declared to be security threats, and how from there on security threats are then dealt with outside of established protocol. So the overall interest that I had and that I found sort of initial answers to in security studies was really what types of extraordinary action become possible under conditions of insecurity. But when I then turned to literature and tried to ultimately write a piece of literary criticism, actually I realized that that starting question took me in a very different direction and took me quite far away from what security studies does. When I looked at American literature of the last 200 years, there was one thing that stood out to me, and that is the focus of literary writers on the idea that states of insecurity make things possible. Insecurity from that perspective does not mean that we are in a position of passivity or passiveness, that we are sort of frozen in the face of threat. Rather, what I saw confirmed in literary writings of the past 200 years is an emphasis on the ability to do things in the face of threat that were heretofore impossible. To give a couple of examples of what that means, these texts all show in one way or another how situations of threat, how situations of insecurity allow for new communities to be forged, new alliances become possible, and being and existence itself in many texts recovers a dimension of meaning that is hidden or lost in the sort of normal state. So all of these things, these productive things, happen in the face of existential threat or what is perceived as such. And this is a finding that differs drastically, I think, from what most people in security studies describe. Both security studies and these literary analyses that I undertook show that insecurity makes things possible, but the crucial question and the crucial difference, of course, is the question for whom. In literature, it appears to me that, at least in the works that I finally picked, that facing threat can be an enabling condition no matter who faces that threat. Whereas people studying actual security crises and situations of stark insecurity usually differentiate between the very few actors who are legitimized to act because of the emergency and the large majority of the population who has to suffer the consequences and is in fact put into the position of passiveness. And the most common explanation how this works from the security studies perspective is that there is a strong recourse and reference to the function of fear. There's a fundamental argument that says people begin to accept extraordinary security measures because people are manipulated to be afraid of what is presented to them as a threat. The suggestion that I develop out of my literary readings is quite in contrast to that thesis, namely that fear itself is an emotion that is far from passive. Fear is an imaginary engagement with an uncertain future. And in experiencing fear, people aren't just put out of their senses. In fact, their senses are often sharpened, and they begin to experience the future in all its uncertainty. And I would suggest that the logic of security actually adds to the fearful future a second or alternative future at the horizon, namely a future in which the threat has been averted. So that fear is always about telling different stories about the future. And so the ultimate claim that I put forward in the book is that insecurity has a strong aesthetic dimension. Insecurity, to be sure, is experienced as fearful, but inside that fear slumbers the potential of the future. And in the experience of insecurity, we get a sense, this is my argument, we get a sense of our own potential empowerment that grows out of that potential of the future. So this is, if you wish, a much more, I guess some people read it as a much more optimistic take than the rather stark analyses that describe the politics of security as a radically authoritarian regime. And I just want to make sure that nobody misunderstands me. I'm not downplaying any authoritarianism. I'm not suggesting that security and the politics of security is a good thing. What I'm trying to answer is the question, how does it actually work? How do we come to accept situations of insecurity on the level of the cultural imaginary? Just to try to avert that misunderstanding. So this is enough to perhaps start the conversation. And at this point, I don't want to ask a question. I want to basically rather offer any of you the chance to perhaps respond by suggesting where you differ or where your disciplinary perspective intersects with that. So I don't know who would like to go first. It seems like Susanna.
I can take, Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. It's really a pleasure to be part of this group. I think these kind of dialogues are really important, and I would say that I think our works actually differ quite a lot, so I'm pleased that we can exchange thoughts on this. But I read with interest your book, and I agree with quite a lot. Perhaps I am more generous with the field of critical, the approach that you call realist approach to critical realism in literature, because having been in this field for a long time, I come very much from a Foucauldian tradition. I draw on Agamben, all these writers that you avoid. So, having said that, I understand why you might think there's some repetition in the work that has been done. Now, I think that things that might be maybe overplayed in this work that has been done by cultural studies scholars and literary scholars. They're not simply just symptomizing security or presenting a stark vision of security. Many of them have engaged with security not only as something that is manipulated by the state, but something that is actually adopted dearly by culture. This is very important. This is a dynamic that we should not undermine. So there is a political interest in security. There has always been. Securitas come from the Latin, and it used to be a goddess, that minor deity that the Roman emperors used in their coins. So it was always linked to empires and fights for stability. But it's also something that culturally we have been, because culture is political, but not only from up down, also down up. Something that we're very attracted to. So I would say that these scholars, literary scholars and cultural scholars, have engaged with the idea of security and insecurity, not only as something that has to do with fear, but if it has to do with fear, it also has to do with desire, and it also has to do with complex tensions that are very tempting for us. We like to see ourselves in the light of security and insecurity, not only as victims. It gives us both roles.
Mm-hmm. That is a very important point that you bring out also in your book, the question of victimhood. You make a strong point in your own work on the prevalence of the genre of the captivity narrative. And your argument, if I understand it correctly, or if I can try to summarize it very shortly, is that security constellations draw on particular narrative templates. And one such template, one such a genre that is evoked, is the captivity narrative, which is actually a transnational phenomenon. We often refer to it in a particular North American context, but as you show, it's not in any way limited to North America. But in any case, the point is that these stories of captivity always play out in the border zone, so to speak. The captives are taken out of their culture. There's a boundary crossing there, and then there are stories of violence, and somehow that violence needs to be reintegrated after the return, after the end of captivity. And so perhaps can you explain where you see the shifts between victimhood on the one hand, captivity narratives being stories about self-victimization, versus aggression? Because I think that's a very important point, and here literary studies perspective already, I think, helps us get a finer nuance on the narrativization of insecurity situations.
Well, thank you for that question. So I'm an American scholar. I'm an Americanist. I started, my PhD was in American studies. And as soon as I started working on security, it was very clear to me that we had been, many of us who do American studies are taught about captivity narratives. They are foundational for the idea of the American state. Like you said, and as I tried to make clear, the fact, even though they are presented as an American narratives, they are Euro-American narratives, because they're Euro-American pioneers, but they come from Europe, and they come from countries like Portugal and Spain, at least in that formation. I'm sure captivity narratives go back to classic times, but in that specific formation that you talk about, when you speak about the Indian American narratives, they're very close to what Portuguese and Spanish were doing when they encountered the so-called barbarians in Africa, etc. So in American literature, it became very clear, but that now, if you look carefully at Portuguese and Spanish literature, you can see the same, that it was very useful to change the story the other way around, to present the, let's speak about the American context, to present the confrontation with the Indians as a staging of the Euro-American captive, when the Euro-American subject is actually taking the home and is actually capturing the Indian. So it's an inversion of the real narrative. And it's extremely important for it has been extremely important for American culture to appropriate that, to give a sign that we were victims of these people when we were actually the people conquering their space. I don't think that's very different from what we're doing with our foreign policies. Not only Americans, but Europeans at the moment. We often like to see ourselves as victims, and we reverse the stories of captivity to present ourselves as victims and to be able to justify our foreign policies. These narratives, if I look at them through your eyes, are extremely interesting, because if you look at both early American captivity narratives or Spanish or Portuguese, which Europeans don't want to do because we're so good, we're not doing this kind of thing, but we did. It shows us that they're actually very complex. As you know, captivity narratives are they're very contradictory. They show an identification between the captive and the captor. So there's lots of different ways of actually reading the captivity narratives rather than narratives of victimhood. But that has been appropriated by American culture and history, and to a certain extent by European culture. And I'll speak a bit more about Europe later, so I don't take all the time. But I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is basically just trying to get all of us into the game. And I wonder, Michael, if you, from a security studies perspective, where you would place discourses of weakness, discourses of victimhood inside the processes of securitization. I'm asking that with a particular sort of thought in my mind, and that is that you have also provided a very different perspective on the role of fear for security situations, in which you don't emphasize that fear is an instrument of the politics of security, but rather you see in following Judith Sklar call for a liberalism of fear, a certain potential of fear to, in a sense, keep the peace, to desecuritize. But perhaps you could address that, how that plays out from your disciplinary perspective, these questions that Susanna raised.
Sure, I'll do my best. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's very, very nice to be here. And thank you, everyone, for coming and for putting on such a gorgeous day. When one comes from the frozen north, it's really nice to see the sun. It's also really interesting for me to move into a world which is not my normal world. The world of literary studies in particular is one in which I feel a certain kind of productive insecurity, in that I realize I have remarkably few tools to bring to the discussion compared to many people here. So let me see if I can contribute something useful. The world of international security is traditionally a world of extremity. Right? It is the world in which fear meets politics in some of its harshest, most brutal, most bloody, and most intense ways. And the ways in which international politics, I think, at least at its most productive, has thought about the politics of fear is precisely in this context of extremity. It's precisely in the context of urgency. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about it is to pick up on the concept that you just brought up of the social imaginary. Okay? And what happens if the social imaginary gets differentiated within security terms, and in which security logics begin to colonize it in various ways? This is one of the great themes of social science of the last 20, 25 years, right? That basically the social world has been colonized by security in a variety of modalities. I think this is true. I don't think there's any doubt, and I think your book handles this extraordinarily well. On the one hand, we have had, I think, undoubtedly, an expansion of the politics of extremity within the social imaginary. I think there is absolutely no doubt that a politics of fear is more powerful now than it has ever been before, and in ways that it has never been before. There's also multiple separate levels at which that works. We have the expansion of logics of risk. We have the expansions of logics of governmentality, et cetera, et cetera. We also have, very, very interestingly, I think, given that we sit in a university, some of the stuff that Frank Ferretti talks about in his most recent book, What's Happened to the University, in which the politics of security has become literally what it is to be a modern subject. And to be rendered insecure now becomes one of our biggest claims of resistance, right? I don't like that idea. We don't say, I don't like that idea anymore. We say, that idea makes me insecure. And somehow as a student, therefore, I have a right not to be insecure, and therefore I have a right not to hear it, okay? Security then infiltrates every part of the social imaginary. And I think one of the most interesting parts of your work, Johannes, is this desire to say, what if there is a productive value of insecurity within the context that you want? That is, that isn't simply a politics of the fear of fear, which I think is remarkably important. I think if you look at contemporary American politics, one of the most powerful counters to the politics of fear is not actually a strong normative claim against it. I think those strong normative claims are weak in the face of fear, to be perfectly honest with you. I think fear is powerful in that way. But I think the fear of fear is actually a remarkably powerful, if very, very complicated and tricky, political mechanism to mobilize. And I think you see this emerging. But one of the questions for me, coming back to you, would be if one wants to try to revalorize or remobilize a more productive sensibility of fear, how much of the social imaginary is left to that project? In other words, if in fact the other forms of security have gradually colonized the social imaginary, where is the social purchase? Where is the cultural location from which a more positive articulation of security as a politics of freedom, or security as a politics of insecurity as a politics of freedom, can actually reside? So theoretically, I like the argument extraordinarily much. Politically, I think it poses for us a very interesting analytic question of what exactly is the social locus from which, to throw the question back to you, you actually see this kind of a politics operating. Mm-hmm. In Cold War, just to shut up for a minute here, in Cold War liberalism, the great locus of this was literary studies, right? It was literature that was going to save us from the McCarthys of the world. This was the great valorization of New York, as God knows what New York is these days, but certainly what New York was in the 1950s, right? The bastion of civilization, because it was, Jackson Pollock and all the rest of it, right? If it no longer is that, then where is that locus? And what do you think is the contemporary possibility for literature to play that role?
Thank you, Michael. This is a tough question and puts me on the spot. And I'll try to perhaps explain what I'm trying to suggest. One way to answer is that to take up the terms of your question and to say there is a security regime and we need to find places outside of that regime. And then to say it used to be the arts, it used to be aesthetics that provided the outside, the hope, the utopian hope. This is now perhaps less of a possibility, it seems, but if you phrase the question like that, what you are in fact doing is you're putting security in the place of what used to be, for a better or worse word, instrumental rationality. Because this is following the same model of argumentation that influenced critical theory from its get-go. And the idea was always we are in a situation in which the space from which we can start, or which we can save for resistance, is getting smaller and smaller. my principal starting point is to reject this idea that there is the regime of security and we need to find a little niche outside of that from which we can then build up an alternative. I'm rather suggesting that we stop thinking in the terms of that, in terms of this evil apparatus that forces us to look outside. Rather, we can look on the inside. The security logic is so complex that, of course, it has at its most basic level all of these authoritarian strands built in and very troublesome. But because inside of the security logic there are other desires operating, to use the term that you used, Susanna, other desires operating, my hope would be to point to those desires, isolate them, give them a voice, have a discourse about those desires that are already at play in a kind of often destructive manner in the security logic, isolate them, shift the political discourse to that. So from within rather than as in the search of the space of resistance. I think that's a fundamental recalibration of the project. But what that entails is and this is sort of the, if you wish, enlightenment aspect of my project. We need, I think, a better awareness of what is actually happening when we subscribe to the logic of security. And rather than declare ourselves to be the victim of that, recognize why we latch onto that, because we are complicit very much in the logic of security. Recognize what it is that makes us latch onto it, isolate the productive strands within that, and then try to shift the discourse to those points. And I think that is still possible. I'm not at all pessimistic about that. It's perhaps not a very concrete answer.
No, it's a terrific answer. I mean, the last thing I want to do, certainly here in Frankfurt, is talk about the colonization of the life world and things like that. That takes me in directions that I think you're right, are important, but nonetheless something that one needs to avoid. One of the question becomes, let me put this very, very bluntly, because we're trying to do interdisciplinary things. Is there a social space in which literature and the insights that you so, I think, really, really remarkably well draw from literature can actually have a purchase outside of literature? Mm-hmm. In other words, is it an accident, as my Marxist friends would like to say, that you find these opportunities within a world of literature, and particularly within a world of novels, rather than within a world of some other part of the social domain? In other words, is there, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just curious. And I realize that I'm putting you on the point here where it's supposed to be the other way around, but that's always fun to do.
I'm grateful.
The real question for me becomes, are we looking here at a point at which, if we put the academic and the social together, at which interdisciplinarity in an academic sense, so what on earth do literary studies and security studies have to do with each other? I would argue, and I completely agree with you, quite a lot, right? Does that academic or intellectual interdisciplinarity have a social referent? And more particularly, does it have a political referent? Does it have an anchor in social and political life that actually could mobilize the kinds of imminent potentials that you see? And if so, where would they be? And what would they look like? Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a question that is an extraordinarily unfair question to ask you, but it's one that I'd actually like to just put out for discussion amongst everyone, and also for discussion amongst the audience if people would like to participate. Because I think it's one of the most crucial issues in the politics of security. Once we remove security from either, and I get the feeling that Susanna and I may slightly disagree here, from either a kind of a Gambenesque nightmare, right, or a Foucauldian flatness, right? once we move it out of either of those possibilities, what is the concrete sets of social imaginaries linked to real social practices through which such an imaginary could actually become socially effective? And for me, as someone who deals in the politics of security, this becomes one of the crucial questions of our time. And I actually think it's where this dialogue actually finds a political purchase as well as an intellectual one that is extremely important.
Can I take
Of
on?
course.
Well, I think this is you put it very well when you asked about the question of place. Where would Johannes find this place, which would be more productive? And it is a concern of yours as well, as a critical studies scholar. And I do not think there is a place outside. I do not. It's within the space of culture that we live in that we have to find it. That means interrogating security. And security has always been, never has been a fixed term, has always been a changing term. So you cannot look outside discourse, Foucauldian discourse, or Agamben's catastrophes. You have to look within this that I call culture. We have to face security as it is today, both a political and a cultural phenomenon. You have to change the idea of security, and then you can be productive. But I don't think there's a locale outside, as I think you both suggest. That might be.
Asta, please.
Quickly intervene. And he is not a security studies scholar, but somebody who's a literary historian and who has worked on in memory studies. But as a literary historian, I would say I would not imagine regimes of security as one realm and then literature as another realm. But literature is part of security regimes, if you want to call it that way. And I think it is part in different ways. And I can imagine that those two ways I envision are somehow connected to Johannes' idea and Susanna's idea about literature and security. Johannes' book is called The Poetics of Insecurity. And I think what you focus on is narrative fiction as a site where insecurity is imagined, and also imagined otherwise. That would be the resources of the imaginary. And you find it not only in the high literature that was so important in the Cold War era, the big classics, the great canon, but of course also you find it in TV serials, you find it in comics and graphic novels, somewhere on YouTube, this imaginary, the poetics of insecurity. I think there might be a second dimension, which I call now the rhetoric of insecurity. So while the poetics is probably security reflexive fiction, the rhetoric of security would be fiction that is security productive, in the sense that it takes part in discourses about what is secure and what is insecure. So it is an active agent in these discourses. And I think if we want to look at that function of literature, we have to move first of all more towards popular literature. I'm thinking about British popular literature of the 19th century, G.A. Henty and his endless empire novels that were distributed to school children. Popular literature, not really good, but it gave generations of young Britons an idea of whether or not it is secure to be to build an empire, for example, in India, and what are the things that could happen to you. So there are these narrative templates, I think, that you were referring to, that are built in literature and that a generation of young, often men, was trained into. And I think once you have these patterns, these templates that often derive from literature in your mind, you will then act. And this, for me, is a process of memory. I know that in international relations, sometimes you think about historical analogues, like in that Neustadt May book, Thinking in Time, the uses of history for decision makers. No? So you have a problem, and an international problem, and you think, is this a bit like First World War, like World War I? So everybody somehow, like sleepwalkers, gets into this war? Or is it a bit like World War II, and there's really an evil person like Hitler we have to get rid of? You take the historical analogy, you make a decision, you take a decision. That would be a very conscious process of referring to the past and of referring to narratives of the past, which are very often literary narratives, because sometimes we don't know if what we remember of First World War is the history books or if it's all quiet on the Western Front. So things are getting mixed in memory. So that would be the very conscious process, but I think even more interesting, but methodologically difficult, are the non-conscious processes. I think there are schemata around that come from collective memory, narrative schemata often, that kind of tell us how to react in the face of threat. And I think that these schemata, in a sense, pre-form our sense of security and our sense of reaction. I just give one quick example. I've worked on British imperialism of the 19th century, and there are many people who say that the Amritsar massacre of the early 20th century, so British soldiers shooting in a mass of Indians who were actually just quiet on a quiet demonstration, that was an effect of the experience of the revolt of Indians of 1857. So 50 years, that was in collective memory. And then you are in a situation again where you think that Indians revolt and you act immediately, you shoot into the mass. And I think that can only happen because the Indian Mutiny was mediated and remediated again over 50 years, mainly in fictional text types, so that everybody had these schemata in their minds. They probably didn't even know where these schemata came from or that they were referring to that earlier revolt. They just knew that's the trigger, that's how to behave in that situation. And I think in this broader field, literature plays an enormously important role in our sense of security.
This brings us so much into the historical question that, Andreas Fahrmann, I think you are almost interpolated here to take up the microphone. And I wonder, from your perspective as a historian who has studied very much in the 19th century, the question of the nation state in the 19th century, whether you would say that, well, first of all, how you would relate to the question of memory, because you have the privilege of having that historian's perspective. But the other question is the more fundamental question about the historical dimension of what we're talking about. Namely, are we dealing here with a problem that is in any way contemporary, or is this a phenomenon of modernity, of perhaps modern statehood, or perhaps not even that, because of course we can go back to the Securitas coins, to be sure.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, and I find this panel fascinating because it forces me to think about a lot of dimensions of security and memory and the interrelation between literature and the non-literary world. And obviously a question historians have been discussing for a while is there actually a divide between history and literature in any meaningful sense? And I'd be inclined to say probably not so much, but that's something we might come back to. But I think I've been pondering whether it doesn't make sense to differentiate different levels of security, as it were. And I think that's a fascinating aspect of your book, that obviously it deals with narratives of individuals facing existential threats. And that produces, or it seemed to me, different potential levels of insecurity, namely insecurity about the outcome. Will the existential threat be realized, or will people survive or reach the state of stability, security they desire? And insecurity about permitted and prohibited ways of acting. And I think that's in a sense relevant because on one level it seems to me that the discourse of security we're talking about today is a relatively recent phenomenon. If I were to think about what the sort of dominant values of the 19th century are for many people and in many contexts, security sort of figures into it in a very definite political, conservative, stabilizing space. There's a book by Wolfram Siemann entitled with a quote, Germans' quietness, security, and order, and it's clear this is about conservative policing. And it's not about a dominant discourse, because there's always the alternative, Germany's insecurity, disorder, and revolution, and sort of loudness, as it were. And if you think about titles that people have given to sort of recent European histories, it's about the pursuit of glory or the pursuit of power or something like that. It's not about the pursuit of security. That would probably be the 1950s onwards history. And it may have something to do with the nature of threat. It may have something to do with the nature of desires, glory and power rather than security and stability. It may have something to do with the social spaces targeted by these narratives, and it may have something to do with the sense of the ability or inability to control risk in a way. And it has something to do with projections of whether the future will probably be better or be the same or be worse than the status quo. And I think what makes the narrative of security so appealing is that the optimism, in a sense of classical modernity, that there's progress seems to be on the verge of fading. And that makes the idea of maintaining stability relatively appealing, would be my reading. But on the other hand, there would be a relatively great normative certainty about ways of behaving. And I think your first case study is in a sense about that. What is the moral actor? And in the present, I was wondering, talking about or listening to the debate on social spaces, how does the discourse of political security and securitization actually relate to discourses of dynamism, insecurity, risk-taking in the market? And the sort of the narrative on the one hand getting society to embrace stability and security as a key norm, and getting workers to embrace insecurity and instability as what the future will hold. And I think some of the cases you covered kind of offer interesting dimensions there, in the sense that people face different choices in different contexts, and that provides space for development. In terms of memory, that's a fascinating argument, and I suppose the problem is how do you prove it? Because obviously there are patterns like sort of the Indian Mutiny, like the so-called Franc-Tireur experiences in the Franco-German War that supposedly lead to overreactions in the First World War, and I'm sure they're transported by literary narratives, either through fictional literature or through oral histories and traditions, but they're also, or it seems to be in that particular case, they also repeated and reenacted in other colonial settings. So you could also argue it comes back via sort of African experiences and so on.
Perhaps should we stay on the memory point before we move to the question of, I think the economic dimension is fascinating, but I want to give you the opportunity to
just a quick response. And how do you prove it? Yes, that is methodologically extremely complex, because I'm making a claim that has to do with history, that has to do with mediatization, with literature, and in the end of the day also with cultural psychology, because it's the idea of schemata, so it goes once or twice through biological brains or heads in order then to take on new life in new contexts. So that certainly is complex, but I think it gives us a sense of what literature and what narratives that become free-floating and disconnected from particular novels, what they do in culture. And then to come back to the potential and to the enabling effects that may be contained in good literature, then I think what we do need is better stories, better narratives that circulate out there. Yeah.
perhaps I'd like to pick up on the distinction that you made earlier on, where you emphasized that what I was approaching is very much about the poetics rather than the circulation of particular narrative patterns. I think that's a very, very useful distinction, and that brings me back actually both to Michael's question about the place from which a counterattack can be started, but also the question of economics plays into this. Because I was thinking while we were talking, well, you know, one of the things that struck me working on the project was how many writers from the early Republic on, from really the early 19th century all the way through to the present, how many writers complain about the deadening effects of being secure, and how many writers in contradistinction then emphasize the enlivening effects of being insecure. There are passages in Henry David Thoreau's Walden where he says, well, in our civilization we go for security that actually makes us more or less dead. We don't want anything to happen to us, but of course if nothing happens to us, we are already in fact dead. And so there is a strong term or a strong tradition of connecting being fully alive with exposing yourself to the value of insecurity. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that in this poetics perspective, so in the perspective that I take up, which is basically asking, how do people in an act of poesis create states of insecurity in their fictions, and how do they experience then these states of insecurity? They tend to come to value it positively, being insecure, as somehow being more alive. And I think this is something that runs through, really, these 200 years. And in interesting ways, it becomes connected to risk-taking of all kinds. Risk-taking becomes also connoted positively, and it becomes connected to economic risk-taking. So that there is a certain confluence of arguing against the politics of security and the effects of security as somehow being civilizationally deadening, and then at the same time saying, or implying at least, that taking risks in the market is perhaps something that is good because it brings us to life. There's a certain pro-market dimension there ideologically that is often, sometimes overtly rejected, but creeps back in. And I think what's changing today is that there is no longer currently a romance with risk-taking of an economic or other kind. That's, especially after 2008, increasingly being impossible to imagine. I mean, some people still do, but literary writers tend to be more skeptical, so that the risk-taking linked to insecurity is more experienced as an imperative, something that defines neoliberal subjecthood, as you described it earlier. So this is where I would perhaps suggest is precisely where the current constellation differs from older traditions. The link between insecurity and economic risk is there, is in a long tradition. The valuation is now changing. The romance of the risk is becoming more problematic. But I was wondering regarding those points. I think that's one of the points where Susanna's perspective in her book differs perhaps most strikingly from mine, because in general, I think you emphasize the points in which insecurity is experienced precisely not as empowering, but as something that expresses anxieties, right? So I wonder from your perspective how that link to the economic and to economic insecurity would look like.
That's a really important question. So finance will continue and risks will always be taken. This discourse about risk will change, but how and on behalf of whom we're going to take that risk is going to continue. The romance will continue to prevail. It will be restructured. So I don't see the end of romance, financial risk-taking romance at all. But I think your question makes me go back to other things and to think about this idea of how economy and apart from the political aspect and apart from the which has been so much talked about, the political economical link to security, there is something about economics, and Agamben speaks about this, which is a question of faith. It's a religious aspect. We believe in debit and credit. And the debit and credit, according to which we live, are not secured at all. But they are the way economics and ethics work at the moment. So we live in this, I think, Agamben's thoughts are very important. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think it's important to take this idea that economy is not unrelated to this cultural aspect, even to a religious aspect, that the way we deal with ideas of security.
This brings out one facet where your argument remarkably differs from mine, and that is that the way I perceive the logic of security is basically within a larger context of secularization. In the simple sense that security brings the future into the realm of what can be influenced, what can be shaped. People may still be religious and all of that, but this is a changing perspective on the future. And although threats, especially of an existential nature, are often experienced as something where you precisely are at a loss of influencing the course of events, still it only becomes a security issue if there is an attempt to undo that looming future. And what you're suggesting here is sort of a counterweight to that, where the way in which finance and the economy at large is being experienced is sort of, if I understand you correctly, in the cultural imaginary perhaps, chaining us again to a fate-like structure, where we have no impact on the future, where we are absolutely helpless in the face of fate. We don't know whether there will be any money left tomorrow.
I think we need to face that. Face is a good word because it's so close to fate, and fate is a word that Portuguese people love. We have this word fado. You know fado? So I'm really not a fatalist, but I think you need to face this straight head on if you want to see security and security change. And we can do that. We can change the meanings of what security and insecurity are.
But can we do so without radically challenging fate? That would be, to me, the question. I mean, I wonder how the others see this larger question. This is really, I think, at the core here is the question: to what degree security is a distinctly modern project or way of looking at the world, and whether it is something that is ultimately thinking of the future in rational terms. It clearly isn't, because fear brings in passion, fear brings in all kinds of things that are seemingly unapproachable to that more future-oriented approach of shaping the future. But still, I wonder how you see that from your perspectives.
Go ahead. I have a lot to say, so I'll wait for a second.
No, go ahead.
No, you please go ahead. No, honestly. Okay. What time are we finishing at, Johannes?
We should. I would like to turn this over for a public discussion with all of you in about, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, super. Then I will be as brief as I can. Two things. First on risk and markets. Clearly, the birth of modern subjectivity is about this, right? The birth of all the dilemmas of modernity in terms of the changing of the links between place and space. All that stuff is clearly tied up with the emergence of risk and all the rest in the modern subject. Two things I think and there has always been an ambivalence around that. Right? There has always been an ambivalence between the desire for risk, the desire for change, the possibility of profit, and the instability, the insecurity that is brought up through that, and clearly that always has affected people differentially in different places at different times. I think we should just take all of that for granted. What is really interesting in terms of the contemporary world for me, to take the situations in which I know best, which are the UK and the United States, you find a powerful move towards a much more, I would call it, old-fashioned conception of security. If you take a look at the current president of the United States, we have the most protectionist billionaire in the history of the United States. If one cannot put those two things together in a paradox, one cannot understand contemporary America. It makes no sense otherwise without seeing both of those as two sides of the same thing. I want to flip this back to your book. I think one of the most compelling chapters in the book is the first study on Republican subjectivity, okay? Where this idea of Johannes tries to articulate this idea that a Republican subject is one who can invent itself, can take those kinds of risks, can be self-limiting and self-governing in a creative way, and that this is fundamental to the origins of the American Republic and to the whole idea of American democracy. One of the reasons I asked you about the social location question is the question to which whether or not this conception of subjectivity, political responsibility, and therefore politics itself is in fact viable any longer. Okay? And I think one of the most, for me, troubling but powerful answers to this question is no. Okay? And very interestingly, this answer comes from something I'm doing a lot of work on at the contemporary moment, which is the emergence of the American right. And one of the interesting things about the American contemporary right, it is not neoliberal. It is not only not neoliberal, it has given up on this idea of Republican subjectivity. My favorite analyst of this, for those of you, hopefully you haven't read this man, but I highly recommend to you if you do, is a man by the name of Sam Francis, who died about 10 years ago. And Francis argues that the days of the American Republic are simply over. That modern government, modern capitalism, and modern culture has so deracinated the American public that it is no longer capable of Republican citizenship. As he puts it, we no longer deserve a republic, we are no longer capable of creating one, and we couldn't preserve it even if someone gave it to us. Okay? Which leaves us with what, Francis says? Actually, he says it leaves us with only one thing: the nation. It is, he argues, only in white American nationalism that you can find a unified modern purpose. And he provides, at the end of this very, very wonderful article, scary but wonderful article of his, an articulation which echoes over the last decade. And he argues that the thing that comes out of this recognition about the death of Republican subjectivity is that there is only one politics viable today, and it is called America First. If one wants to understand the provenance rhetorically of that thrice repeated inaugural address statement by the current president, one does not find it in Republican subjectivity. One finds it in Sam Francis and in the idea that Republican subjectivity is no longer politically viable in the United States. I regard that as an open question. But what I think is really, really interesting is that there is a powerful political perspective on the scene right now that ultimately rejects the idea of this form of subjectivity as socially and politically viable. And I regard that as both extremely important to recognize and extremely troubling. And that, I think, is, again, one of the really interesting things that emerges, an important thing that emerges out of taking these questions seriously.
And I think that's partly an answer to the question of how contemporary is this moment. And I think there are good arguments to be made. Secularization is one potential line of thought. The rise of the bureaucratic state and its ability to influence acting and not acting on the ground rather than just in rhetoric and in normative texts. The appeal to the nation, or the resurgence of an appeal to the nation as the place that provides security, and I think Marine Le Pen used this phrase, the nation that protects, is what she wants to reinstate against the forces of, or the destabilizing forces of republicanism and the market. I think that explains why both the appeal of the securitization discourse, that, as you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, it does go counter to a lot of trends that things have become a lot more secure, even in the sense of limited risk to individual biographies than it has been ever, probably. Depending, obviously, very much on where you are in the world, but still, in many places, it has become more secure. Yet the appeal to security as a goal has become so much stronger. And I think that has a lot to do with the loss of a transcendental perspective as to where the real security might lie. And it has a lot to do with the confluence of particular technological and ideological trends in a given moment in time.
Could we say that this is a return actually of an older model of security, which is absolutely dead set on drawing boundaries, on distinguishing between inside, outside, us and them? Isn't this ultimately the model that you were relating to us, which is a type of model that builds on the idea that you can be secure, insecurity is the enemy on the outside or the enemy within which needs to be expelled? And that's a very different concept from what we have come to embrace when we, for instance, are asked in the name of security to manage our health, where we are constantly embracing the fact that insecurity is everywhere and all we can do is still somehow manage it. So this seems to me two different conceptions of security. What you're describing is the return of an older model.
Yes.
Is that correct?
I think that is correct. But it's a return of an older model, not in the sense of a return to a set of fundamental certainties in a fact-based manner. Okay, it is an assertion, if you like, and the paradoxes here are really, really interesting. It is a postmodern pre-modernism. Okay, it takes quite logically almost all of the social consequences drawn out by the sociology of postmodernity, blah, 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 and it says, where does this lead us? This does not lead us into a wonderful world of play and difference and all that kind of stuff. What it does is it leads us into a strategic re-essentialism that is in fact precisely both strategic and re-essentializing. Mm-hmm. And in that way, it becomes a very, very interesting dimension of all kinds of weird things that are going on in the people on this Rosterman in this room understand probably much better than I do, to do with the contemporary, the transformative nature of truth in contemporary politics. Okay? When, forgive me, the wonderful person, Kellyanne Conway, okay, articulated the much joked about idea of alternative facts, that was not a slip of the tongue, right? That was a vision from within the Trumpian White House, right? As one of the most interesting books on contemporary Russia puts it, right? Nothing is true and everything is possible, okay? That, I think, is a strong logic of contemporary politics. And if that is true, if it is true that we live in a post-truth world in which the most powerful political position is to be able to accept post-truth and articulate an essentialism anyway, then a lot of our critical categories get profoundly displaced. And I think this is one of the most difficult things in contemporary politics, which is what happens if a lot of what we usually consider to be a critical apparatus has already been absorbed by the things that we're applying it to. And in fact, has been absorbed in such a way that is being thrown back on us in ways that renders our own positions largely marginal. And that, I think, is really an important challenge. I may be completely wrong. I will also now not talk so much.
This is a moment at which we can open it up. We have a microphone here, so if you have a question and would like to contribute, we'd be more than welcome. I see Robert Clark in the back.
Okay, thank you. It's a very interesting discussion, and quite a lot of thoughts have come to my mind as I've been listening. So I've had to be selective in what I want to ask. And one of them is, there's been a lot of emphasis on the fact that security now is at a level that it has never been before. In other words, it's become a dominating narrative. And I would like to put a skeptical voice to that. Astrid mentioned the Dwyer outrage in Amritsar, and thinking about the British Empire, and particularly the literature of the British Empire, it seems to me that this was a pervasive narrative of the British Empire. When one thinks of Paul Scott or Forster, even Orwell, security was a massive issue. How to keep this thing together with so few people. If we go back a little bit further into the bureaucratized states of Central Europe, Prussia being one of them, Russia another, we have security states which were almost obsessed with maintaining security and keeping things together. And we go back further than that, we have almost every city in the world had a wall around it. And that wall controlled people coming in and going out. In other words, security was at the center of so many elements of the past. And I wonder what so particularly characterizes the present anxiety about security, which we can say is distinctively different from those previous eras. Michael Williams, you've just mentioned you mentioned the way that we're living in an age of post-truth, which of course immediately made me think of Newspeak and 1984. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on what I've asked, but is there really a difference? Is there really a difference in our contemporary world to these fairly obvious historical examples of insecurity from the past?
Okay, I'll answer briefly. I think that's a very important question, and I think security narratives have been there all the time. Like I talked about captivity narratives. I spoke about the use of these minor deity securitas in the Roman Empire. So definitely has played a role. But if you want to really go back, let's say to the Roman Empire, it's interesting that securitas meant without concern, sine cura. So it was something which was already ambivalent. It was security and insecurity in itself. So it brought out already the securitas, of course, evoked the possibility of insecurity, but it was not absorbed by the subject as something that was part of his responsibility. This only Securitas, for the goddess Securitas, is this carefree deity. She's sitting comfortably and in a holding, I don't know, there's a stick or something that she's. So there's this idea that you should be unconcerned about something. And then with St. Augustine and with Christianity, religion is absorbed by the everyday subject in a way that is very important for us to consider today, because I think that is the difference, and that's where it's very important that we see that it's not. Whereas the state continues to play with this, and I would not undermine this at all, because my work is all about politics, and it's about the role of the state in the way we use security. But what really fascinates me and concerns me is the way that we subjects, secular subjects mainly now, I'm definitely not religious, but I understand the psychological mechanisms through which I'm so attracted to the concept. And that modernity has amplified that and continues to amplify that. We're told again and again that it's our business to work for security. So I think that's how it has changed. It's this emphasis of us playing a role in that within culture. But maybe Michael has some.
Historians are better.
Well, just to focus on this point of the specific modernity of security, I mean, I think everything you've said is obviously true, and the observations are pertinent. But I think the idea of the walled city does also illustrate the difference. I mean, it's an island of security in a dark, insecure world, where everybody's aware that security is not going to happen. The Prussian security state, sort of by modern standards, is relatively rule-based, in the sense that there are a lot of things that security cannot justify, like penetrating the private home, sort of reading the correspondence. And again, it does with a relatively small proportion of, as it were, the national resources. And I think that has changed, and I think there's a valid question about whether these sort of quantitative changes don't make for a quantitative tipping point. Plus, one I think could have an argument like Jim Sheehan sort of postulated a few years ago about whether the sort of demise of the open display of military prowess and heroism in many countries says something about the sort of relationship between security and seeking out insecure situations. And I think the return of the fascination with military parades is an interesting sort of moment in this development as well, which could call into question this idea that security is now a qualitatively different thing from what it was before. In a sense, my answer would be the jury's out as to what change means in that respect.
Okay, we have a question up here, Jan Willem. And then right after that, perhaps we can collect two, because we are short in time. Pavan Malradi is right next to him, also has a question.
Yes, thanks very much for this very productive and fascinating discussion. If I may both comment and query, perhaps. As a comment, I would just like to say what Johannes said in the beginning, that there is this sense of potentiality being wrought from the idea that the future is uncertain. I think I agree with that, but I would also just comment and note something that D.W. Winnicott, of course, said about the patient's fear being not that which hasn't happened, but that which has happened, right? So the fear of something that has already occurred. My question leads to something that, in the direction of something that Michael Williams said, namely his question, where is the place of literature to comment on insecurity and perhaps aid security? I think the liberal idea, or the demand made by liberalism on literature was the demand being of aiding security, helping with the chaos of society, was, I think, a deeply flawed demand based on a highly limited idea of what literature actually is, and that being sort of apart from society, something that Astrid Erll, of course, said, there being literature on the one hand and society on the other. And I think the response by postmodernist authors to that was to say, leave us alone with that. We're part of you, and we don't have the answers that you don't have either, right? What I'm asking, why am I giving this sort of long-winded preface to that, is this limited idea of literature, I think, is based on the idea that literature is the realist novel. And I think it's problematic to say that, society functions like the realist novel. Society has to function like an Aristotelian logic. There is a conflict, and that conflict is being resolved. I wonder, and this is a question to Johannes. Johannes, I'm deeply sympathetic to your arguments in your book. But I wonder, and this is a childish question, but let the child speak. Why did you exclude poetry as a genre? Because poetry, regardless of what it is immediately detached from that Aristotelian logic of resolving conflict. And I'm not asking it in a polemical way, I'm just interested in it. And perhaps the answer is that society does function like the Aristotelian narrative.
Perhaps I'll answer right away. I can give a short version in the interest of time. What I'm interested in the book is precisely the question of narrative. I'm not interested in an Aristotelian resolution, but I am interested in the way narrative works, and the way narrative works is through moments of transgression of an established order. And in fiction and in fictional narratives, again, not limited to the realist novel by any way, these moments of transgression are seen from two perspectives at once. They are on the one hand perceived as threatening, but they are at the same time perceived as liberating, as making things possible. And so fictional narratives, and it is related to fiction, I can't go into this right now, allow us to see this two-sidedness, that in a relation where we are dealing with real-life events and where we cannot say it's just fiction, don't worry, where we don't have the comfort of the as-if, where we lose sight of that two-sidedness. But my point is that the two-sidedness that we see clearly in fictional narratives is there in the way we construct our social narratives about security as well. And that's something that has to do with narrative and can't be really articulated by reading poetry, as much as, or as intriguing as that project would have been too. Yes. But perhaps we can then move straight to Pavan's question.
Because Jan mentioned about poetry, I know if you're probably aware of this film Interstellar, which is an apocalyptic movie, and there is these lines of Dylan Thomas: "Do not go gentle into that night. Rage against the dying of the light." I mean, that in a way sort of brings me back into the very discourse of insecurity. I'm not saying that this is all evident in Johannes' book, but his book provides a platform to inflect on larger issues of insecurity that are in confluence with whole other range of insecurities in the so-called post-millennial age, which includes like end times narratives, financial meltdown, the marginalization of Southern Europe, plastic apocalypse, so on. All these are in confluence, right? But to me, much of the discourse, the way it is framed in this room, appears to me as an affective insecurity. Affective with an A, yeah. Which in itself is interesting, and literature is primarily equipped to address that. But I also wonder, what are the objects of these affects, right? To me, at times it occurs to me it is an objectless discourse. Insecurity of what? Insecurity about what? Insecurity by whom, right? And I just want to quote one example from an Iraqi writer. I just wanted to point towards the different scales of this. Sharon Antoon wrote a book called The Corpse Washer, right? And in the post-2003, post-occupation, the corpse washing business was in such boom. Every other business was down, right? And this young fellow who wants to become a sculptor at the Baghdad Academy of Arts decides to take up his father's profession of corpse washing just because it is too insecure to pursue a career in arts, right? So these absence of objects in the Euro-American context reconfigure as ghosts among these corpses to be washed. So literature has a role to play, but it's not just, say, European literature or American literature, but I would say it's the literature of the world, you know. And I'm not directing this to Johannes, but I'm in deeply admiration of the book because Susanna's and your work are among the first in literature to bring this to a platform to discuss these things, and I think there is much to be done outside of this frame and take this into a larger world. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody, Astrid, do you want to respond to that, perhaps? You don't
just in order to agree, and what struck me, not being an Americanist, of course we always choose our corpus, yes. But that strong emphasis that you have on security, insecurity, and the rise of capitalism, taking risk, that is an American perspective, and the quick realization that there is a religious discourse connected to it. That, to me, too, is a very Americanist perspective. So, yeah, absolutely. I think the next step would be to open up this to the realm of world literature and see what security, insecurity means in Bangladesh, in South Africa, and or South America, yeah.
Yes. I can only second that and say that I wish I could have written many more chapters. But in the end, it is a book in American literary criticism and already trying to pack in 200 years into one book, which is insane. Final question back there in Tom Clark in the corner there. And then we have to leave the room.
Thanks. I'll try to make it quick, but I have two issues or questions. One is about the Republican subject. Don't you think that from the very get-go that is a very problematic construct in American history, both because it excludes vast swaths of the American population at that time and later, and that other parts of the American population, for example, the romance of the immigrant is security, not insecurity, right? It's the search for stability, not for less than for social mobility even. So isn't that Republican subject a profoundly bourgeois, ultimately subject which explains the link to capitalism? And then, of course, ironically, American capitalism thoroughly corrodes this Republican subject until there's nothing left of it, essentially, in the 21st century, right? So these problems that come up in terms of class and many other issues, in terms of the limits of Republican subjectivity, even in 1776, I would argue. My second interest is that nexus of literature and the political. And I've been very interested in the sort of social anthropological and ethnographic work that deals with a politics of the sensible, as François Laplantine calls it, or a sensory politics that tries to think a post-Cartesian logic of using the productive tension between sort of the world, the inevitable and always present world of the sensory and the emotions, which is kind of an ideographic world, right? An irreducibly complex world, and bringing that into this productive tension with the nomothetic of the logos, the law, and the rationality that we imagine politics is, which it mostly is not if we take a closer look. right? And so the aesthetic, really,
Yeah.
even more than the aesthetic, becomes the locus of thinking about politics in a new and perhaps, I mean, Laplantine imagines, more egalitarian and diversity-embracing way than the always already exclusionary nomothetic. Thanks.
Maybe not me, but somebody
I think the first question is for you, because I would have the same question.
I'll quickly say something to that, and I'll make this very brief. What I try to do with the Republican subject is not to sort of rehearse an established notion of the Republican subject, but precisely to tease out of the text, which is a novel by Charles Brockden Brown called Arthur Mervyn, to tease out of that text a kind of a revisionary, excuse me. So the Arthur Mervyn novel basically, I think, shows a type of the Republican subject that we usually don't see, in which uncertainty itself is elevated to a virtue. Usually the Republican subject seems to be very paranoid in the sense of trying to make sure that human vice doesn't lead to the immediate collapse of the Republic. And so this is a kind of a defensive conception of what the Republican subject needs to do. What we get in this novel is that there is also an alternative view of the Republican subject in which uncertainty itself is not only tolerated, but positively charged. And so I share the sort of the skepticism about the whole notion, about its exclusionary nature, etc., but what interested me here was sort of that when we look at security and in the early Republic place it there, we see that the Republican subject is actually much more open to uncertainty than it is usually presented. That's right.
I think both Pavan's question and your question are quite similar. That in order to, if you say this, then we have to ask what kind of insecurity are you talking about? Because this post-rank society, this anxiety about the changing of social status that you refer to is one specific kind of security, insecurity. There are others. There's if you are not from the middle class, then you have insecurity about getting your food home or having a job. If you are a slave, you don't know what's the tomorrow's date. So it's not about how socially mobile you can be. There are other kinds of security that have to do with other kinds of subjectivity, even within the subjects that you're dealing with. So I think that was an important question.
I absolutely see that. And the point that Pavan made is very important. We have to be specific about the referent and about what context we're talking about when we describe sources of insecurity and strategies for achieving security, and they are particular. But this also means that whatever you're going to describe and point to is going to be limited. You always are going to study something that is particular. Right? And this is certainly the case in my case studies, that they are all about particularized concerns which I look at through the lens of security. And that doesn't mean that security is about just that one concern, but that provides the lens for me to look at a particular processing of uncertainty that I call the connection between security and insecurity. So yes, I absolutely find that vital to be specific and to be aware what you exclude. Right? Okay. Any further? Yes?
Yeah. Two quick responses. One to the very interesting question that first came up. I think your skepticism towards the pervasiveness of security is a very good one. I do think, on the other hand, that there is something profound that has happened in terms of its modalities. And it just to move out of the realms of fiction for a minute into the realms of fact, in a past life I did a bunch of work on the globalization of private security. And unfortunately I don't have the facts at my fingertips anymore, and they're a little bit outdated. But just to give you one, the largest private employer on the African continent is the private security firm Group 4 Securicor, which employs, at least as best we could estimate, approximately 600,000 people on the continent. It is, and I'm pretty sure that this is still true, one of the top 10 employers on the planet. Okay? Almost nobody knows about this. It's everywhere. I'm sure, unfortunately, there were none on your campus today. Look, because that's what happens when you become a security person. You start to look for it everywhere. But I'm sure it's here if we look for it a little bit more strongly. Just a simple example. This is Germany. It'll be different here, I'm sure.
Can I just respond?
Sure.
My immediate response to that would be to think of Russia that was portrayed in Conrad's Upper Western Islands, for instance, and to then think about the number of personnel under the Tsar who were involved quite directly in security, and I'm sure those numbers were also pretty large.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that it's entirely comparable, but there's a sort of similarity.
There is, although there are very interestingly shifting modalities when it becomes your own personal responsibility to do that, right, and a commercialized logic. So I think you're absolutely right, but there are really, really interesting transformations taking place. To the really interesting question about the aesthetic, and here I wish we had more time for, again, people who are more adept at these things than I am. One of my current interests is on the impact of the visual in global security. And which brings together the affective, and I truly don't want to go the visual culture route on this for a wide variety of reasons. But if it is true that we are moving to some degree into a post-literate society, then I think we get a very interesting question about how visuality plays into the kinds of questions. I thought what Astrid had to say about memory here is incredibly important, right? And we now do have, if you take a look, for example, at Bill Clinton, once known as the reader-in-chief, right, because of his voracious reading habits, Barack Obama, who read an amazing number of books, the current president, who reads no books, but who does watch at least 4 hours of Fox a day. Okay? There is something interesting going on here in terms of the kinds of transformation of narrative carriers that are taking place. And I think that's a really interesting challenge for the future.
That is a perfect final remark. I want to thank all of you up here on the podium for participating. It's been, I think, very interesting and productive. I want to thank all of you for coming, for asking questions. Please stick around for a little bit until they kick us out and have a cup of coffee or a glass of water, and so that we can continue the conversation just a few minutes more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.